Welcome back, everybody. Once again, this is Sandy Boucher, and we're hosting the Continuity of Care Forum, the 7 Youth Inquest for 2022. I am so excited to introduce you to our keynote speaker today. Dr. Pamela Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, author, and social justice activist from Eel River Bar First Nation. She has 4 university degrees, including a doctorate in law from Dalhousie University, specializing in Indigenous law. She currently holds the position of full professor and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. Pam was one of the spokespeople and public educators for the Idle No More movement and advocates alongside other movements, focusing on social justice and human rights. She is frequently called as a legal expert before parliamentary, Senate, and United Nations committees dealing with laws and policies impacting Indigenous peoples, and is considered one of Canada's top 25 influential movers and shakers by the Financial Post. And I just want to add in from a personal perspective, as an Anishinaabe, thank you so much, Pam, for being a consistent example of how strong an Indigenous woman's voice can be. Welcome, Dr. Pam Palmater.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for that wonderful introduction and for those really kind words. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I come from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded Mi'kmaqi, which is on the east coast of Canada. And my home community is Ugbaganjig, which, as Sandy said, is Eel River Bar First Nation. But today, I'm coming to you from the sovereign territory of Mississaugas of Scugog, who are facing similar issues, the destruction of their lands, the violations of their treaty rights, and their human rights. That's why it's so important that we always stand in solidarity with one another. And I want to thank Anishinaabe Nation leadership, the First Nation leaders, the staff, the community, and the families for allowing me to be part of this very special event. And to the elders who open your session, and to the drummers who soothe our spirits with the heartbeats of our ancestors, always making sure that we have these conversations grounded in culture. And I'm also very honored to be a part of this conversation, because these are issues that are very important, but also very sensitive. The issues we're talking about at this gathering speak to historic and ongoing violence, racism, and injustice, but also the heartache that it leaves behind in mothers, fathers, uncles, aunties, siblings, and entire communities. And I want to specifically acknowledge the precious children whose lives were cut short and the pain that it leaves behind. The work you've all done to ensure that the whole world knows about the 7 Youth Inquest and the investigations into other youth in your area is critical to ensuring that things change. Not 500 years from now, not 10 years after another 10 years of meetings, but now in the days and weeks that follow. The open wounds in our families, communities, and nations speak to the urgent need to move beyond government promises and move towards substantive action. And I think the logo of this conference really says it all, that everybody participating here, we're holding very gently in our hands the hearts and minds and bodies and spirits of all of us in our First Nation communities and the very sensitive issues that we're dealing with. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today about cultural safety in First Nation education, something that you're already working on and you've been working on for quite some time. And I believe that the groundwork you're doing, specifically in cultural safety for children, youth, young adults, and education, is a powerful example of where we should all be headed. And I think it's this issue of cultural safety is widely misunderstood by governments, education systems, and all of the supporting agencies, whether it be policing, child and family services, healthcare. We didn't create the problems that exist today. But our families and communities are the ones who pay the price, and we have the burden of forcing the change that we need. It's unfair, but I see everybody in your community stepping up to do this. And so your work in relation to cultural safety and education is absolutely essential. But before we get to that work of cultural safety, I think it's important to set the context for how we got here, because sometimes we're joined in these conferences by government officials or non-native people who work in our communities or in different agencies, and they also have to understand the context. We know the history because we lived it and we continue to live it. But I have found that there's often a gap between what governments and society think they know about the past and how that past continues to operate in the present. So it's not just a sad chapter of our history, it's ongoing. So you sometimes hear comments from governments or some segments of society that tell us just to get over it, but you can't get over harms that have never stopped. In other words, what's happened in the past has created intergenerational trauma and injury, but it also manifests and gets multiplied many times over today by new traumas and new injuries. And it's very unfortunate that all of Canada didn't grow up learning about First Nations in their K-12 education systems or their colleges and universities, training institutes, or by public education. And that includes government leaders, healthcare professionals, police agencies, and teachers. And for those that did, and had some teachings on First Nations issues, it was largely historicized, and any injustices were either erased, minimized, or softened. And while public education is important to better understanding how historic injustices manifest today, especially in education, their lack of education on First Nations is not an excuse for some of the issues that we deal with today. For example, police officers don't need to know which prime minister referred to us as the Indian problem in order for them to do their jobs and investigate crimes against our children. Doctors don't need to know exactly which churches operated residential schools in which area in order for them to do the very best job they can providing the best healthcare to our children and families. And similarly, teachers don't need to know all the complexities of the Indian Act and all of the different sections of the Indian Act or how it was amended over time in order to do the very best professional job and treat our children with respect and dignity in the classroom. So we have got to stop using excuses and hold people to account for their lack of action and their misdeeds. You see, a lack of knowledge has been used for generations as an excuse for racism, violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation of First Nations. And the same thing can be said of cultural awareness training. Now, don't get me wrong, cultural awareness is very important. But when police officers shoot an unarmed First Nations youth, or doctors refuse to treat a First Nation mother, those are acts of violence and racism, not cultural misunderstanding. You see, the problem is with them, not with us. The problem has never been about our cultures. The problem has always been about their racism. And that's why I prefer to talk specifically about cultural safety instead of cultural awareness. Cultural safety is grounded first and foremost in anti-racism. That means specifically confronting racism in all of its forms and all of the ways in which it manifests. But before we do that, I think it's important for Canadians to understand our story starts before contact. Almost all of these discussions start with contact and the things that have happened since contact. And we don't really acknowledge or celebrate just how powerful we were as nations prior to contact, like long before the violent colonization of our Indigenous lands and bodies. From time immemorial, we had complex sovereign nations with our own sophisticated governments, political systems, complex legal regimes, trading networks. We had our own economies, our own well-trained militaries, we defended our territories, as well as our rich cultural traditions, customs, and practices, and beliefs. Indigenous governance systems were very complex. They tried to reduce us down just to culture, and culture is important. But then they forget the whole aspect of our nationhood and how it's all tied together. Indigenous governance systems pre-contact varied all across what's referred to as Turtle Island, and leadership took a variety of forms depending on which nation you came from. But in general, our nations had powerful male and female leaders who were negotiators and politicians, who were warriors, who were translators, who were business people, who were scientists. Our traditional laws and theories and legal traditions have been refined for thousands of years and have worked well. We update them, we change them, we make sure they fit the current circumstances. But just think of how powerful our laws must have been to have served us so well for thousands and thousands of years. What other society can say that? So that's something that we need to be proud of and non-Native people need to acknowledge. And the other really important thing to understand, especially in how education and healthcare go hand in hand, is that from all of the early records of settlers and missionaries and historians, Indigenous peoples were physically fit, muscular, and exceptionally healthy with very few chronic illnesses. And while practices varied, most were physically active, ate a variety of foods from hunting, fishing, gathering, trade, or farming. And the most recent archaeological studies show that First Nations here in what's now known as Canada had very little, if any, dental cavities, and it would be rare for them to have incidences of diabetes. Now compare that to today. That's why it's important for non-Native people to actually understand where we came from, that this isn't just the way we are. Canada had to work for hundreds of years to force us into a situation where we have health problems or mental health issues or physical issues or any of these other things. The other really important thing that has been noted in all of these historical records is the way we engaged in healthcare and education about healthcare, that it was supportive, communal, holistic, and set in our cultural context and community obligation. That meant that illnesses and injuries healed far faster than those of Europeans because everybody contributed to those processes. And while it's important to note that obviously there's difference between nations, some of our medicines and health practices and the way we educated about those practices were far more advanced and effective than those of Europeans. Imagine that some of our sister nations, the Inca, had brain surgery techniques that were far more effective and less lethal than those carried out by Civil War doctors in modern times. So we can't forget about the strength and the power of our knowledge and why that has to be the root of our education systems. And we know from my family has told me many stories about my grandmother, who was a traditional healer in our Mi'kmaq Nation. She knew all of the medicinal traits of plants. She knew how to teach this to other people, and she had a far higher success rate in treating settlers. The same can be said of our education. Keeping in mind, education was never something that was separate or detached for any of our other practices. It was done in a holistic way, where we passed on our traditional Indigenous knowledges, which included knowledges gathered from our relationships with other Indigenous nations. Our education was centered on traditional Indigenous knowledge that did include spirituality, culture, and language, but also focused on transmitting history, political relations, and past leaders to instill pride in our children, learn from historical lessons so that we would know how to move forward with nation building in the future. And this traditional education, although sometimes it gets minimized to only culture and only language, also includes environmental science, physics, geology, math, astronomy, and other sciences, as well as things like I've mentioned, medicine and health practices. And again, just like health, our education traditionally was set in the context of our families, our villages, houses, clans, districts, however we were divided up, so that it included teachings about our families, our local areas, and national politics and intertribal relations and political relationships. And all of that was intertwined with all of the teachings and what we've learned from the earth, the water, the sun, the moon, the sky, birds, animals, fish, and plants. Our teachers were more than just humans. Our teachers were also the animal nations all around us. In other words, education was set deep within the cultural safety and context of our nations. Our cultures were foundational to that part of learning. And the safety and security we found within our cultures allowed our children to learn, take risks, explore, and engage with all aspects of the world without fear. And that's the difference. There wasn't any fear. They knew they were safe. They knew they were protected. And so there was no limit to what they could imagine for themselves. And the nourishment from traditional foods, physical activity, and pride in our culture allowed them to blossom in mind, body, and spirit. And that's what education is about. It is a lifelong process that is not based in fear, discrimination, violence, abuse, neglect, or exploitation. That's our collective story. It's one of power and strength and pride and love and humility. And that's very different. That's very different from what we see today. While our nations on Turtle Island have many different experiences with settlers at different points in time, what we do share is the devastating impacts of colonization, which was rooted in greed, power, and violence by both settlers and settler governments, pre and post Confederation. Our nations were and continue to be confronted by genocidal laws, policies, practices that significantly reduced our populations and had long-lasting impacts on all of our health and education systems, including impacts on mental, physical, and spiritual health. And an underlying feature of government policy was to directly attack, outlaw, and try to erase our cultures, languages, and all of that traditional knowledge and our education system. The government policy for education can be summed up by what the Superintendent of Indian Affairs said at the time, Duncan Campbell Scott. I want to get rid of the Indian problem, and our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian left in Canada. And that included whether we lost our children in residential schools and any other policy that came afterwards, whether we lost our children in the 60s scoop, lost our children in foster care, or lost our children in what's happening in Thunder Bay right now. And what was the objective? What was the objective? It was to obtain our lands and resources and reduce any financial obligations they might have had to us because of treaties. Our children were taken out of their culture, their safety of their culture, their family, and their community, and taught that this culture, the sense of safety, was wrong, and they were forced to learn European cultures. So they took that cultural safety away from our children and our people. This led to a significant loss and impact, and obviously in Indigenous languages, cultures, but it also resulted in a loss and devastating impacts to our people. We know that the last residential school closed in 1996, but the ongoing policies continue in different forms. The modern day control of educational content, standards, methods, assessments, locations, and timing, largely by the provinces and non-native people, has contributed to the continual loss of our culture and has stripped them of their cultural safety. Add to this racism, abuse, neglect, and violence that they sometimes receive at the hands of educators, as well as healthcare professionals, and of course, law enforcement. And this is a recipe for shame, substandard learning, and even loss. This is not even a remote semblance of what education should be in a First Nation context. The spirit and intent of our treaties, from a First Nation perspective, when they weren't signed under duress, were intended to be about mutual respect and mutual prosperity, knowing that education is a key part of that. And our ancestors spoke clearly to ensuring that we had all forms of education. And we know from both Indigenous laws and human rights laws, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that we have the right to govern ourselves and maintain our own education systems. And within the context of education, to be free from forced assimilation, violence, or discrimination. And the other thing that UNDRIP says is not only do we have a right to our own education systems and to have control over education systems outside of our communities, but we have a right to be provided with all of the ways and means necessary to achieve the kind of education we want on or off reserve. And ways and means funding, infrastructure, or whatever supports we need. That's what we're entitled to. However, right now, we know we don't receive the necessary funding. We don't receive the necessary infrastructure, and it's certainly not based on actual costs, population growth, inflation, location, or the actual need. It is no good to plan for a certain level of instruction when students might need extra instruction and that's not funded. These represent fundamental breaches of our treaties, Aboriginal rights, Canadian laws, international human rights laws, and this has been documented time and time and time again with regards to our education by the United Nations, by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. There have been and continue to be countless studies, commissions, inquiries, coroner's reports, inquests, and investigations that show that historical attitudes, policies, and practices based on racism continue towards First Nations today, especially in education, which all of you know too well. And we know that these practices extend beyond just racism in society and government and have long-lasting impacts on our health, safety, and well-being, and particularly with regards to our kids in education. We know racism manifests as poor socioeconomic conditions, which are exacerbated by substandard education systems, which limit opportunities for the future. But here's the most important thing for non-Native people and Native people to understand. None of this is our fault. None of this lies at our feet. None of it, no matter what they say. There is no such thing as us living high-risk lifestyles. All of the ways in which we have found to try to navigate genocide and racism at every turn is a sign of strength and survival. Genocide's not a high-risk lifestyle. Genocide is the worst crime that can ever be committed against a people in the entire world. So how we navigate it, whether they like it or not, whether it matches with their laws or not, that is not our fault and it doesn't lie at our feet. Canada effectively took the education system and weaponized it against us. And now it is so fraught with systemic racism in education and all of its related institutions like healthcare and policing and child and family services that it has created an incredible barrier. So if we are to confront systemic racism in education, we have to go back to looking at it in a holistic perspective. The foundation of education is good physical health, mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, and kind, supportive, loving relationships with families, communities, friends, and society. And this is where cultural safety comes in, as well as seeing ourselves reflected in every aspect of education and the paths available to us going forward. A foundation of cultural safety in education has the power to radically change not only how we deliver First Nation education, but where and who's in control of that and what they learn. So I'm going to go over some key points that I think are important in understanding cultural safety. One, we have to move beyond cultural competency, cultural awareness, and cultural sensitivity. I think every single report, inquiry, and commission that's ever been done, you name it, it's always the top recommendation. Police forces have been engaged in cultural awareness training and cultural sensitivity training for years. What impact has that had? And that's what we have to look at, not the box they get to tick, but what is the impact or the outcome? So cultural sensitivity is really about learning to understand that there's differences in culture and being sensitive to that. Okay, cultural awareness is education that tells you that there's differences in culture and to be aware of it and what some of those other cultural cultures might be. Okay, cultural competency, working with Indigenous peoples, learning from them to see how that fits in your institution. Okay, all of these can be important elements of cultural safety, but it's not cultural safety in and of itself. And of course, education for everyone is working with First Nations. Yes, that's important. But cultural safety moves us beyond the superficial, beyond the once a year or once every 5-year professional development training. And it's focused on confronting systemic racism and power imbalances within these institutions vis-a-vis First Nations. That means it is no longer good enough for institutions to be culturally aware or dedicated to reconciliation. They must also address the power imbalances. Who has the decision-making power? Who creates and maintains these systems? And who has all the resources? We also, part of that is, how do historic injustices compound today? Who's responsible? Who should be accountable? It's also about making space. And sometimes that means moving over. It could be shared governance, but it could also be exclusive governance. Cultural safety is also centered on confronting racism head on in all of its forms and being intentionally anti-racist. And what I mean by that is, it is not good enough for educators, administrators, or government institutions to think that they're not racist, or for individuals to not act in a racist way. They must also be active, consistent, and persistent in confronting and ending racism in all of its forms by other people and in these institutions. They have to actively engage in that. That means they must be deliberately anti-racist every single day, taking actions to further anti-racism. And that is especially important in education. But think about the institutions that are connected to education, like healthcare and policing, all of whom have significant impacts. And so we don't need to go down the road of having arguments over whether the racism is intentional or unintentional, whether it's overt racism, unconscious racism, whether it's in the policies or in the people. Understand, it's in everything. It's all of those things working at the same time. It's about the impact and the outcome of people's actions and attitudes, not whether they had intention and not whether they're a good person. It's what is the impact and outcomes. That's what needs to be measured. And we've long focused on the wrong parts. We need to focus on the impact and the outcome. The other thing about cultural safety is that it's about constructing systems that ensure that there are no actions that could even possibly remotely diminish, demean, or disempower the cultural identity and health, safety, and well-being of our First Nations children in school. That happens when racism leads to discriminatory treatment in education, which means, say, disproportionate discipline, suspensions, expulsions, but it also operates as underserving or neglecting or ignoring both First Nations students and families. It can mean failing to prevent violence, abuse, and bullying, or the failure to investigate both within education systems and in conjunction with policing, and failing to hold people to account or having any consequence. It includes all of these institutions because policing and healthcare and child and family services, they can either bolster and support education of our kids, or they can entirely derail it. And that's what we're trying to get at. We know that cultural safety is about confronting areas of racism and acknowledging all of the ways in which it intersects with other forms of discrimination against First Nations. So racism and sexism, racism and misogyny, racism and homophobia, racism and ableism, any one of those combinations, it serves to discriminate and disadvantage our kids and families. And that means that all of the ways in which racism can combine becomes increasingly and exponentially more damaging. And so we can't forget that aspect of racism, that sometimes there's multiple layers. Cultural safety in education also includes the cultural context from which students originate. So cultural safety, not just for the child, but cultural safety for the families and for the student, for the communities. That means the child has to come from a culturally safe place. And they can only do that if their family comes from a culturally safe place. And they can only do that if their community represents that. That means healthcare or education is directly tied to sufficient, adequate, and safe housing, access to clean water and sanitation, access to healthy, nutritional foods, access to quality healthcare and mental health care, preventative child and family services, shelters and protection from violence, respect for Aboriginal treaty and land rights, and the enforcement of our basic human rights. All of that is actually a part of education. So oftentimes, education and other institutions try to hive off what they consider to be within their realm of jurisdiction. Well, you cannot engage in education in a culturally safe way without being a part of all of those things in these communities. Another issue around cultural safety, which is exceptionally important and almost always gets overlooked, is that there must be accountability and reparations for the harms that are caused from student to student to student and family to community. Accountability means real consequences for racism, real consequences for violence and abuse and neglect. Zero tolerance needs to actually mean zero tolerance, not you're going to be put off work for a day, not you need to go take some cultural sensitivity training that you've taken 5 times already. Real, concrete consequences for these actions that continue to hurt our children. It means First Nations being able to engage in data collection so that we can measure all of the impacts and the outcomes and own that data and decide what we do with that data. But it also means monitoring, reporting on, and transparency in all of these educational institutions. Nothing done in secret, nothing not disclosed. All of it has to be out in the open. Now, the other part of this is reparations. So what happens when harm is done? Well, reparations can take a wide variety of forms, and it depends on what happens and what the First Nation or family wants at the time, but it can and should include compensation. And it can and should include specialized programs, additional educational supports, whatever it takes, mentors, tutors, coaches, specialized attention in higher education, memorials, awards. All of this is not extra. This is the bare minimum human rights standard to have an education system that's culturally safe and free from racism, where there's accountability, transparency, and consequence. And we can see from residential schools, 60 Scoop, foster care, police shootings, discrimination in healthcare, there is almost never any substantive consequence for those doing the harm. What is the disincentive for them to stop? What does it tell other people, especially when they often get promoted? So we've seen instances where police officers shoot an unarmed First Nation youth. And because of all the controversy, they get promoted and moved somewhere else, but promoted nonetheless. Think about this in an educational context. People who have been racist their whole lives in education now become the principal. And now they have even greater power, control, and influence over education. And that's why this last part of cultural safety in education for First Nations has to include the empowerment of the purposefully, intentionally disempowered. That means First Nations themselves need to be decision makers. Families, students need to have agency and be decision makers in what's happening in education. First Nations need to have their rights to be self-determining in education in all aspects of it, respected, enforced, and funded. That's what the UN talks about when it says the ways and means. We need to have access to all of our lands, all of our resources from our traditional territories, and be supported with all of the infrastructure and training that we determine that we need. Again, that's the ways and means that Canada and the provinces are obligated to provide us as a basic minimum human rights standard. We need to see obviously more First Nations as educators, but supported in the education system. Because we often look at what's happening to the children and families who are going through the education system, but there are First Nations educators in the system trying to change the system who are being subjected to the same aspects of racism and violence and sexism and abuse and exclusion. How are we going to keep and maintain our First Nation educators in this context? So we have to look very widely when we think about cultural safety. We have to ensure that parents and students and communities know their rights and know all of the systems and know all of the avenues to pursue their rights and get information. We have to be able to identify racism and abuse in all of its forms. We need to create a system where we can have access to justice, safe mechanisms where we can address issues or complaints without retaliation on the student, the family, or the community. And incredibly important, in order to implement First Nation self-determination over education on and off reserve, is the transfer of power. Who's making these decisions, who's creating these systems, who's designing the curriculum, and who says what's in education and what isn't. Now that's going to be really uncomfortable for a lot of people already in the system. That's how you know you're disrupting the system, because what is the system? The system is the status quo, and the status quo is inherently and systemically racist and violent towards First Nations people. So if we're not making people uncomfortable, if we're not making systems and institutions uncomfortable, then we're not headed in the right direction. And that means less soft words, less benefit of the doubt, and more calling it as it is and holding people to account. And this is going to be the same across the board. Now, just by way of analogy, there have been many reports about racism in healthcare, racism that's anti-First Nation racism in healthcare. They've found that there's widespread anti-First Nation stereotyping and racism and discrimination in health, that it limits their access to medical treatment and has negative impacts on health and well-being, or cancer survival rates, for example, that First Nation women and girls are disproportionately impacted by anti-First Nation racism in healthcare, and that the current health system magnifies racism, promotes racism, and has no disincentive for it. And we know that this isn't just in health. So all of the same stereotypes that police officers or healthcare workers have, the same ones are had in education, that we're less worthy of education, that we are all just bad parents, we don't know how to govern ourselves, we're less capable, and that's racism. So what's important to understand from that is racism isn't just about name calling or what they call microaggressions or insults. It does include that, but it's the impact of racism on Indigenous peoples and their outcomes. And so that's why cultural safety has to be fiercely anti-racist in its implementation. It means that we have to deal with all of the institutions at the same time, strengthen First Nations jurisdiction, and make sure that all of it changes, to never let up, never let it go, never give governments and institutions the benefit of the doubt. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. The proof is in the outcome, and that's something that we can measure. So they don't get a pat on the back for being sad, or their hearts and minds being with us, or they're committed to reconciliation. They get a pat on the back when they stand up and say, we are racist, it is hurting our people, we are responsible, and we are going to change under the lead of First Nations. That's when they get a pat on the back, because all of it has to change. We can't lose any more of our children. We can't lose any more of our families who are forever impacted by grief. We know that our laws are based on our sovereign powers to govern ourselves. Our treaties acknowledge our status as sovereign nations. All of the international community recognizes our right to be self-determining and our right to control our own education. So the status quo, which is so ingrained in racism that they often can't even see it. And in some studies, especially the one in BC on healthcare, some people were so racist in the healthcare system that they used racist stereotypes to defend their racism as not being racist. Can you imagine, like, the circular nature and the illogical paths that you have to follow to try to justify being racist as not being racist while being racist? So I know all of you know the status quo has to be broken. And I know that it will be broken because of your tireless advocacy for your children, your families, and communities. NAN is powerful. So are all of the First Nations who belong to NAN, on all of the families, and your education about what's happening in Ontario and what's happening in Thunder Bay has spread to the rest of the country. You are being heard, and support is building from all corners, even if you don't see it every single day. The work you've done is foundational for you achieving cultural safety for your kids and education, and for us in other territories. Your work is leading the way. And I know this has come at a terrible cost and permanent wounds. Another reason why it's so important that we do this work. I believe you will be successful. And I believe when you're successful, we're successful. And we're doing this all together, while our ancestors walk beside us, for those we've lost, those we've left behind, and our future children. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, and I stand with you as you move forward in addressing First Nation education. Thank you.
Miigwech. I'm sitting here and I thought my only comment is yes. Just yes, in so many ways. And you touched on so many things. I love the impact and outcome, and that's it, right? Don't tell me the promises, don't tell me your commitment. What has changed as a result of this? One of my favorite quotes of yours, and I use it all of the time, is if it's convenient, it's not reconciliation. And I know that's what I hear all the time. Like you described how multifaceted this is. And that's the excuse they use. Well, you know, where did we start? There's so many different things. And that's why when you were talking, I was thinking a vision of what we want is so important, so that every decision can be weighed against that vision. Is this getting us closer to that power, to that cultural safety, to that, you know, autonomy we need? And so thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful. Now, just for the participants watching here, Pam has an incredibly busy schedule and she's got to be out of here right at 11:30. She's got a flight to catch. So I'm going to be shutting down questions at 11:25. So get your questions in like right now. This is your chance to ask so that I can pass them on to her. I know she's very interested in answering your questions. We're just going to make sure she has time to do it. So type fast. But so yesterday, Pam, you weren't here for the discussion, obviously, but one of the questions that came up was, is there some place in Canada that Thunder Bay could look to as they are doing good work, or at least, you know, as some examples of things that are going in the right way? So if I were to present that to you, what would come to mind?
Well, I'm always of two minds about what's often labeled as best cases or great examples, because it's always in a different territory, different province, different political circumstances, different treaties, you know, different history. Yeah. That being said, I've always followed what the Mohawks are doing in their communities around taking over full jurisdiction of their education, and the way they prioritize, say, language immersion, for example, the way they prioritize understanding the way Mohawk governments work, and the Iroquois Confederacy and the Haudenosaunee and their history, and all of that is part of an education within the cultural safety of their communities. And they implement many of these things that we're talking about, and how they are fiercely anti-racist when it comes to working in systems off reserve. But you know, this is what NAN communities are doing right now. So I would hate to say, you know, look to them, because you're doing it. I mean, I know about exactly what's happening and the concerns around children who have to leave their communities for education, and all of the things around that: policing and healthcare, finding a place to live, transportation, all of the things that most Canadians don't have to think about. Kid walks to school or hops on the school bus and they never have to worry or fear. We do. And so I'm actually learning more from what the NAN communities are doing and how they're grappling with this and the impacts of it, and the change that's needed. And I think they need to continue doing what they're doing, because it's powerful work when you're doing it yourself.
Yeah, you just made me realize something. And I swear unpacking is so part of this, because we've got caught up in the BS too, right? So we have to think about how we're looking at things. And when that question came up yesterday, it was municipalities looking at other municipalities. And it's like, wait a minute, that's not even where you should be looking. It's looking at the First Nation. So thank you so much for that. I have a question for you, and now you're going to love this one. Okay. What response would you provide a school board that asked, and this is what they asked, what might be 2 or 3 indicators of reconciliation?
Oh, when First Nations have control over the school boards, and when you see a report that says there's 100% attendance, 100% achievement, they all went on to university or training or became volunteers in their community, that means whatever you did in your system brought you to a place where there was a positive outcome. And that's how you measure reconciliation, not in all the meetings and committees and policies and statements and apologies you make, but the outcome. So if a school board can says we have 100% of this, fantastic. That's reconciliation. I don't care about your processes.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm definitely seeing is, don't keep pushing our kids through, right? Like if you failed, right? So you failed to provide them with the quality education, but you want the numbers to be able to say you graduated 80% of your Indigenous population, and prepared them for nothing, right? So,
you've prepared them to struggle and probably not be able to succeed in the next grade and the next grade. And all of this, as you know, is cumulative, so that by the time you get to university, you have students asking, well, you know, I didn't do any of my assignments, or I didn't, you know, do any of this stuff, or I never learned how to write an essay. I never learned how to do research. And the expectation is for us to pass them. And it's like, there's a very different process at universities than there is at school, and we do a disservice. And so just pushing them through thinking, oh, well, I'm being anti-racist by doing that. Actually, no, you're not. Our kids need to be warriors and get this stuff. And so you've got to do whatever you can. If the kid isn't getting it and you feel like you have to push them through, that's your failure, not the
100%.
child. And you need to account for that. So whether it's extra tutoring, training, whatever it is, you need to make sure that it doesn't happen the next year, and consequences. So for teachers who keep doing that, consequences.
Yeah. You don't fix the flower, you fix the environment in which it grows. Absolutely,
Yes.
100% agree. There's a comment here. Thank you so much, Dr. Palmater, for this powerful and inspiring presentation. Can only say 1000% agree. So many others need to hear your powerful and uncompromising words. This is what all folks across the country need to hear, Indigenous and non-Indigenous in all sectors. I so agree. The excuse is it's so much work that we're not going to do anything. And it's like, no, that just, it doesn't fly. I love this focus on cultural safety. I have long said, get your hands off our kids if you can't keep them safe, right? Like, don't invite our kids into your institution if you can't guarantee their safety while they're there. And I think that's a bare minimum. Like you said, like, I'm not asking for the world here. Would you hand me your kid if I couldn't guarantee their safety? I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
So thank you. And thank you for highlighting the work of NAN. It's so true. Like, the weight of this, the responsibility of this, but also, like you said, for Indigenous, it's not a choice, right? For these communities, it's their children. It's not anything they can ignore or just pretend didn't happen. And we wouldn't want to anyway. It's our children.
Exactly.
Right?
And for us as relations, I'm from the Mi'kmaq Nation, but we're relatives, we're relations. We also have a corresponding obligation to support the struggles of other Indigenous nations, other First Nations. And the only way for us to do that is when we know what's happening. And NAN has made sure in a very unfailing way that all of these tragedies that have happened, people are going to know about it. And people are going to be held to account, and things are going to change. And we all learn from that. So everything NAN's doing, I can take that back and say, okay, when I'm working with other First Nations or my own First Nation, here's what we need to make sure never happens in our community. Look at what NAN's going through, and also make sure that we dedicate time to lift up the voices of NAN and lift up what's happening and help educate the world about what's happening there, so that NAN doesn't ever feel alone. Those communities and families don't feel alone, because we're all there supporting them.
I love that. Here's the last question. How can I explain to Caucasian individuals how important mental health and culture, ceremonies, teachings, how important they are and crucial for Anishinaabe students to learn? They can't seem to understand that mental health and culture go hand in hand for overall well-being for our students.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that we seem to bear the burden of trying to educate and explain to others, not on a large basis, like not only what we're doing here, but on a individual by individual basis. It's like we're called to have to justify ourselves and justify our positions and justify what we need to individuals over and over and over again. And I always tell people, listen, self-educate. Go read the TRC, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing, the inquest into the 7 youth, and then come to me and have an educated conversation. But don't expect me to do the labor for you. That's actually your job. Yeah. You're the one with the problem. If you don't get it already why that's important, then you've got some work to do. It's not on us. And I think that's an unfair burden. Now, some of us are public educators, so we try to do that. But I just tell people, part of this is self-educating, and you need to do some work on the importance of mental health with regards to culture.
And even at its base, again, back to what you were saying, how it all comes back to racism, the fact that we're saying what our kids need and that's being questioned, it's like, what other parent would be questioned when they say, no, I know this is what my kid needs, right? Like,
exactly. Anyway. We don't need to justify ourselves. We don't even need to, they're always saying evidence-based data. You know what? We don't need that. Self-determination means we say what we need, when we need it, how we need it, and how much we need, and you deal with it.
Yeah. And we definitely have the data and the proof that the way things are being done is not working. for
No.
Indigenous youth. So thank you so much for coming out today, Pam. That was an absolutely positive, powerful speech. Thank you for reminding us how strong we are, as always. You can follow Pam's podcast, and she's all over the place. She's absolutely amazing. So if you found inspiration in her words, you definitely got to follow her. So it's definitely worth doing. We are going to take a short break now. Now, if anyone was traumatized or upset by this, remember Elder Lucy Kakagamic is available in the events or the elders tab. She's available by phone or email. We are going to take a short break and we are coming back at 11:45. Take care, everyone. Pam, safe journey. Enjoy your flight.
Thank you.
Take care. Oh, I forgot our player code. You're going to need this. Write this down. Lawyer, you're going to need this for the play to win. So don't forget to write that down, guys. See you after the break.